Good evening and welcome. Tonight we'll be going over the history and geography of Colombia. Let me get pencil. Colombia is in the north area of South America. That's really weird to say, but there it is. It is bordered by Panama up here. It's bordered by Venezuela, Brazil, Peru, and Ecuador. And it also borders the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean here on the Caribbean Sea. It is the only country in South America to border both oceans. It has some really interesting areas. It's one of those countries that seems to have like every type of ecosystem, so I'm just going to go north to south and go through them. So I'm going to start up here in the Caribbean Sea. Colombia is home to about 40 or so different islands up here and in the Pacific Ocean as well. Some of them are very luxurious and tourist spots. Some of them are not. One is a former prison colony, so many different types of islands. Up here, this area is known as the Guajira Peninsula or the Guajira Peninsula. I think there's places in Colombia that are pronounced differently in American English than other English and Spanish, so forgive me if things don't sound right. Apparently that's how they are. Let me bring this down just a smidge so you can see all of it. There we go. The Guajira Peninsula up here. You can see it's a little brown. This section right here is very deserty, very dry, rocky. There's cactuses, just things you think of when you think of like a barren desert. Kind of reminds me of like the Mexico desert near the coast in northern Mexico. It looks sort of like the same kind of desert area. But along here on the coast is much greener. There is a little mountain range up here known as the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. It contains the highest point in Colombia. It's not on here, but it's about right there. So it is called Pico Cristobal Colon, and it is named after Christopher Columbus, since Cristobal Colon is Christopher Columbus in Spanish. Colombia, by the way, is named after Columbus. There's also, right by it, its little neighbor peak, Pico Simon Bolivar. And, whoever thought of that is very clever, to have these two giant peaks named after important figures in Colombia's history. Very clever. This area up here is really dominated by the Magdalena River. You can see flowing out here into the ocean, into this big delta area. Makes the land very fertile, and obviously the coastline up here has a lot of commerce, not to mention history and tourism, things like that. This city is another one of those places where it's pronounced differently depending on where you are in the world. I've mainly heard Cartagena when people say it, but when I research it, when I read it, it says Cartagena in the pronunciation, so I'm not sure which one to go with. I pre-filmed all the other Colombia videos. I said Cartagena, so if it's extremely wrong, please forgive me. I'm just doing my best here. But anyway, major cities along here. Barranquilla is another one. Santa Marta, of course, we'll talk about in its history. On this side of the coast, it's very, very wet because we have mountains up here that we'll talk about in a minute. So the rain from the ocean hits here and stops over here, but I'm getting ahead of myself. It's very, very rainy over here. This area is known as the Choco Coast, and lots of places here as well, but not nearly as much as you can see major cities up here. So these are the highlands of Colombia. You can see the capital city of Bogota right here. It is very mountainous, and the mountains I'm talking about are big. There's volcanoes, snow-capped peaks, things like that. It is basically the tail end or start, I don't know, of the Andes mountain range. It forks into three different ranges or cordilleras. We have the Cordillera Occidental, the Cordillera Central, which is labeled there, and the Cordillera Oriental. Really interesting. It makes all these valleys and things like that, and it's like the historical heart of Colombia. Like I said, the Magdalena River runs through it, and it's a very urbanized industrial place, especially with the capital city being there, and all of its suburbs and things like that. But once we get down from the mountains, like I said, the rain comes, drops here, hits the mountains, and stops. So this area up here, we talked a little bit about this area in my Venezuela video, since it goes like this. This is the Janos Plain. It is much drier than the rest of Colombia. Not so much up here, but very, very dry. But it's also very flat, and that leads to lots of good agriculture as well. There's also oil reserves in this area. And there are lots of big rivers. The Orinoco River flows right by. There's the Rio Marta, right? But then we get down to here. You can see the Orinoquia Amazonia. It's labeled right here. This is part of the Amazon rainforest. And not a lot of people live here. Basically, the only people that do are native people, or what is the word? Like, when they're just living their tribal lives undisturbed in the area. There are some towns, and down here as well, they're not labeled, but I think it's 3% of the population lives in this section alone. So it is very, very forested, like Amazon rainforest. Like, think the Amazon, thick, thick jungle, and lots of life. All sorts of different kind of animals, big and small, hairy and scaly and flying, all sorts of different kinds of animals. One of my favorites, the capybara, lives here. Lots of beautiful birds, insects, frogs, jaguars, crocodiles, like just so much life is in Colombia. All throughout Colombia, like there's all different kinds of little ecosystems and creatures that you can find all around. It is the second most biodiverse country in the world, next to Brazil. And it's mainly because of this Amazon rainforest over here. Let me check my notes, see if I got everything. I believe so. There's so much to Colombia's geography, so many beautiful things. So we're going to talk about its history, and then we'll flip through this book, and I'll show you some fantastic pictures of Colombia. So, when people crossed the Bering Strait, came down through North and Central America, crossed through here, and entered this region, very lush and jungly and wonderful, it attracted a lot of ancient peoples and cultures. The earliest human habitation in what is now Colombia started around 12,500 BCE. By the first millennium BCE, many cultures had reached great heights in terms of building and like their own economy, their own traditions, their own architecture, everything. There are different kinds of indigenous peoples all throughout. We have like the Wayu tribe up here. We have the Tironas in the north. In the center, there was the Muisca or the Chibcha peoples. I mean, there's so many to mention. It reminds me a bit of like North American native peoples, like depending on what geographical region they were in, their culture, their traditions, their ways of life were completely different. It's so interesting. Also, there was a culture, I believe it's like down here in this area, that was just known as the San Augustine culture. And they were one of those that rose up, were thriving, and then just abandoned and disappeared, and no one knows why or what happened to them. But they built some really fantastic sculptures and left behind some amazing architectural finds. It's really, really beautiful. But the main one we're going to talk about are the Muisca and its history, or the Chibcha, depending on what you would like to call them. So You can hear my cat waking up in the background there. Anyway, in 1499, the first Spanish explorers made contact here on the Guajira Peninsula. His name was Alonso de Ojeda. The first settlement in all of South America occurred up here in Colombia. It would have been Santa Marta, and it was established in 1510. Eventually, this area became known as the New Kingdom of Granada. And, it went through a bunch of little different Granada-themed name changes, but that was basically what Spain would like to call the territory, in a sense. It was coined, I believe, by Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, who was a conquistador, essentially. He and many other Spanish and various European explorers came to this area to look for El Dorado, the famed city of gold that they believe existed somewhere up here in the mountains. So, in 1538, he sailed down the Magdalena River and wound up finding the Muisca tribe. He wound up conquering them and taking over their land and establishing what would eventually become the city of Bogota, right in their territory. Obviously, no one ever found El Dorado because it doesn't exist, but Colombia did have a lot of gold in it, also a lot of emeralds. I think it's 90% of the world's emeralds come from Colombia. Not to mention all the other economic endeavors that Spain could use the land for. So, very interestingly, Spain had this law, I suppose, where any people that they conquered became Spanish citizens. So like the Muisca tribe, for example, since their territory was taken over by the Spanish, anyone who lived there was now a citizen of Spain. And two, you could not enslave a Spanish citizen. So, they did find loopholes and found ways to exploit the people that lived here for labor, but they couldn't capture them as slaves like other native peoples were throughout the Americas. So, of course, they did the next best thing and imported kidnapped Africans to work as slaves. That began in the 16th century. And to this day, there is a very large African Colombian population, mainly up here along the coast. But it's still an ethnic group that is very prominent to this day because of that. So, skip ahead to 1739. Britain went to war with Spain. Britain's style of warfare at this time, along with France, they like to do it to each other, was to just go after their colonies and territories and take it over, like for funsies, basically, and try to one-up each other. So Britain really tried to do that over here. And they actually had a huge naval battle out here in Cartagena, whatever you like to call it. And the Spanish actually won. It was one of the biggest naval successes against the British, which was a big deal because Britain had the largest naval force in the world at that time. So it was very, very exciting. However, the Spanish Empire was in a bit of a decline around this time, especially after Napoleon came by and took over the country. A lot of rebel movements at that time took advantage of that. In 1810, a rebel group established their own country. They issued a Declaration of Independence on July 20th and said, we no longer belong to Spain. And, started forming their own country. So once Napoleon was booted out and the Spanish king and everything got back control, they were like, wait a second. No, we don't accept this. So they came and started to fight. And one of the biggest heroes, like hero number one, like the George Washington of the situation, was Simón Bolívar. He and many other people, I'm not going to get into it, fought back against the Spanish and eventually defeated them in 1822. Simón Bolívar is also famous for establishing Gran Colombia in 1819, which I talked a bit about in my Venezuela video. Gran Colombia was basically a big mashup of all the land that had been declared independent from Spain, I suppose. And Bolivar's dream was to create the whole continent as like a big free state that's just one big group of people. But he got started here in the north. It basically consisted of pretty much all of today Colombia and Venezuela, parts of Panama. It had Ecuador and parts of Peru and Brazil. It was a massive country for its time to just start off as a brand new country. But it eventually collapsed since it was so huge and so spread out and had so many different peoples and groups in it that they wound up just leaving in pieces and basically becoming some of the countries that you see today. Particularly Colombia became its own thing at that time and started their own government and had their own new political parties. And there were two major ones, a liberal and conservative party, and they both disagreed on how the country should be ran. You know, they said, let's split it up into departments. That would be, strong, and the central government would be weaker and just oversee everything. The other party said, let's have one big, strong central government that just rules over everything. It was a big back and forth that eventually turned into a civil war in 1863. There's also the Thousand Days War from 1899 to 1902. It was a very unstable time. Meanwhile, this area of Panama was part of Colombia, and the United States was interested in building the canal through there. So they actually paid off Colombia to basically annex this area to make it its own independent nation so that they could build the Panama Canal. And Colombia agreed and let them have it in exchange for money. Very clever, I suppose. Also, just briefly, Colombia did go to war with Peru over territory in the Amazon, which Colombia wound up winning in the end. Just a little aside. So the era that I'm trying to get to, I'll just skip to it. In the late 1940s, early 1950s was an era known as La Violencia, which is when those two parties really went at it in the biggest possible way. The president was assassinated during the start of all of this turmoil. It led to massive demonstrations, very deadly riots in Bogota, and it stretched on for way too long, and it was way too violent and so extreme and very horrifying. It's something that we won't get into on a relaxation channel. So what the two parties decided to do was set up the National Front in 1958. It essentially ended La Violencia, but their plan was to switch off the government every presidential term for 4 terms and just let each other, take turns leading the country. But this didn't wind up working out. The plan was to wait after 4 terms and to see where they were going from there and to, work it out. But it basically fell apart. Lots of, protests and rebel movements popped up against it. It led to full-on guerrilla groups, full-on guerrilla warfare. In particular, there were 3 major ones known as FARC, the ELN, and M19. They were extremely violent, and anyway, it's a relaxation channel. Paramilitary groups sprung up from the military that disagreed with the government and how it was ran, so they started fighting back against the government, and not to mention the guerrillas would fight back against them as well. And then drug cartels took advantage of all of this chaos, and their business exploded, and the drug trade was extremely profitable, and they wound up being able to afford their own military in a sense, and they fought back against the guerrillas and the paramilitary and the government. This is where we get Pablo Escobar, one of the richest probably like the richest drug lord ever to live, ever. It was just a huge, huge mess. And it's something that Colombia is still associated with today, even though it happened quite a bit ago. It really reached its peak in the early 1990s. The government wrote a new constitution in 1991, trying to modernize the government. Peace talks began throughout the 1990s. That led to some paramilitaries falling apart, because if the military is being reformed, it's kind of hard to work. The U.S. really helped out in these peace talks. people started to really have enough and rose up in protest against FARC, since they were like holding hostages. Like, I'm not going to get into how horrible everything was. It was really bad. But the protests were actually like doing things, and it was, awesome. It all culminated in November 2016 when FARC and the president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, worked out their peace deal. Juan Manuel Santos wound up winning the Nobel Peace Prize after this, and there is still some tension today, but it isn't nearly what it was. The drug cartels are still operating, but not nearly at the height that they were in the 1980s and 1990s. It's all very toned down in that aspect. It's much improved on that front. There are still some guerrilla groups out there. It's just not as prevalent of a threat as it used to be. Here's what I think. It's because I said like Colombia was really associated with like guerrilla gangs and drug cartels, and it really shouldn't be at this point, because it's not what Colombia is really about anymore. Like, it is a part of life, but not a major part of Colombian life anymore, and it's kind of sad that it is still associated with Colombia. But moving on, Colombia hasn't been completely stabilized after that. There have been other issues that have popped up. The two major ones, in my opinion, one of them has to do with Venezuela. So tensions have been pretty tight between these countries. Venezuela is going through its own thing. You can see it in my video. It's essentially been taken over by a dictatorship. Colombia tried to offer aid, which Venezuela denied, even though the Venezuelan people could desperately use any kind of aid. Colombia does not recognize Nicolas Maduro as the leader of Venezuela. It's a whole to-do. It's very, very tense, especially in places along the border. Also, number two, in 2021, protests started against the government for a couple of reasons, mainly due to a tax bill, which no one wants increased taxes during a pandemic. Also was protests against like government corruption, all of those things that huge protests wind up being about. But police brutality has skyrocketed during these protests. People have gone missing. It's really, really rough and still ongoing today. It started in about April 2021. Still a point of contention. Still could really go anywhere at this point. So we'll have to see what happens to Colombia in the future. But, this country has been through so much. I feel like people are just tired of any kind of BS, to put it lightly. And enough is enough, and we're ready for positive change in Colombia. So why don't we flip through this book and look at some beautiful pictures of Colombia. Look at these beautiful costumes as they dance. Isn't that lovely? Let me put pencil down for a minute and let's look through the book. Colombia. How beautiful. Isn't she lovely? So nice. Let's see. There's a beautiful picture. You can see the mountains in the background. This is in Socorro. Let's see what we have. Beautiful city. Let's see, what is this? This is Cartagena, established in 1533, one of the oldest cities in Colombia. Here we can see the political map of Colombia. You can really see where just like people don't live here. Did I say that's the Guaviare River? I said it was the Orinoco. My bad. Orinoco River's on the border. Anyway, my apologies. Here's a man harvesting some coca, which, is the main ingredient of Coca-Cola when it was first formed, when it was first created, and for nothing else. Anyway, here's Juan Manuel Santos. He was president when this book came out. He's no longer the president. His term is ended. We won't get into the presidential drama for there in Colombia right now, but this is a tourist carriage seeing the sights. Beautiful, beautiful beaches. Doesn't that look luxurious? Look at the big rocks up here. So lovely. Let's see. We have some of the foresty, rivery areas, and you can see a geographical map of Colombia. You can see the big Janos region there, the mountains. That's the big mountain up there. And let's see what we have over here. More beautiful mountains. So green. Up in the clouds. So lovely. So this is El Cocoy National Park. So this is what I'm talking about when I say it's like very like deserty up there in that peninsula. Here's a big volcano. This is Mount Julia. It is the highest volcano in Colombia, it says. Here's in the lowlands. He's navigating through a swamp here. And this is in the Chocó region I told you about, along the Pacific coast. Very wet, like I told you. Yeah, look how beautiful. Beautiful plains. Look at the sun. This river is the, let's see, it's the Caño Cristales. And there's lots of different plant life and bacteria life living throughout this river, and it's many, many different colors as the river goes through the jungle. It's called the liquid rainbow, it says on here. Let's see, this is, oh, these are on the islands in the Caribbean. Isn't that lovely? Blue and old, a very, very blue lizard. And this is in Barranquilla. It's very, very rainy that day. Some of the deserts up in the Guajira Peninsula. Very deserty and dry, like I told you. Let's see, this is left Ermita Church in Cali, which is right here, Colombia. And this is, I believe it's Medellin. I've heard it pronounced differently a few ways. It is right up here. Anyway, a beautiful sloth, isn't it sweet? Sloths are so lovely. We have some succulents, it looks like. They're frailejones. And there's the condor, the Andean condor. I believe it's the biggest flying bird in the world. Could be wrong. Sweet toucan. I love these birds. They're so lovely. Howler monkey, and a beautiful waterfall. Let's see if it says where this waterfall is. Oh well, anyway. What else do we have here? More desert up in the, this is the Tatacoa Desert. And here's a poison dart frog. Don't touch this guy. He'll be a bad time. Beautiful orchids grow all throughout Colombia and the jungles. Here's a giant armadillo, looking adorable. Oh, this is pretty. It's a little painting of, let's see, the Tairona people up in the north, what their homes used to look like. Here's one of the San Augustine statues. Isn't that neat? That's so cool. They made so many little statues like this. Well, little, they're pretty big, but just very unique statues. Like there aren't any ancient culture statues like these anywhere. European exploration. So Alonso de Ojeda, like I told you about, came down to here and sailed up there. We have Sebastian de Belalcázar. He's in red. He went from Santa Marta down here to, when it was first established, it was Santa Fe de Bogota. Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, like I mentioned to you, he went that way. And then Nicolaus Federman, he was a naturalist, so he traveled through Venezuela and Colombia, exploring the wildlife and flora and fauna, and looking for El Dorado. Speaking of, some of the beautiful gold that was found throughout the ancient cultures here. There is a museum of gold in Bogota showing off basically what El Dorado would look like if it were real. Sebastián de Belalcázar in Cali, city that he founded. This is what Bogota looked like in the 1700s, apparently. And this is in Cartagena, some of the beautiful old buildings there. Here's a map of Gran Colombia, so you could see at that time it was Venezuela, New Granada, and Ecuador. So, yes, a massive, massive country for its time. For a brand new country to just spring up out of nothing to be that big is very ambitious. This is Policarpa, who was a spy during the rebel times. And if you're a channel member, I do a weekly podcast, and I have an episode planned about her, so I'm going to talk about her later. Barranquilla, very beautiful. And this is on a plantation. Let's see, it's a coffee plantation. Coffee is a major, major export. President Enrique Olaya Herrera. And this is during a riot in Bogota in 1948. You can see they knocked over the trolley cars. This is FARC, one of the troops guarding a road, it looks like. And police seizing some snow in these packages. It looks like very snowy packages. Some peace talks. You can see George H.W. Bush there, along with the president, Virgilio Barca. And one of the protests against FARC. You can see all the people protesting, wanting their lives back. Some armed forces trying to repair relations with the children there. And a busy, typical day in Colombia today. The Colombian Congress building, very old and beautiful. Very Spanish, isn't it? That's obviously for a reason. Let's read about the flag. It says, Colombia's flag consists of 3 horizontal bands of color, yellow, blue, and red. The yellow stripe, which covers the top half of the flag, represents the wealth of the nation. The blue stripe stands for the Atlantic and Pacific oceans on the nation's borders. The red stripe stands for the bloodshed to gain independence. The current flag was adopted in 1861. This is Maria Angela Green, I believe, Colombia's Minister of Foreign Affairs in 2010. Here's Juan Manuel Santos again. Like I said, he was president when this book came out. Here he is addressing the Congress. There's the Supreme Court. This magnificently bearded man wrote the national anthem. People lining up to vote. And here is Bogota, major city center. You can see the big central map, very grid layout. And here's a picture from that Museum of Gold that I mentioned. Coffee beans. Coffee's a big, big part of the industry. Colombia. Potatoes. Lots and lots of potatoes. Here's a resource map. You can really see how the mountains affect the resources here in Colombia. This guy's herding some cows. This is what Colombian pesos look like. Fishing. Got oil worker. And here is a coal mine. Installing some solar panels because, you know, that is the future. And working hard in school. What are they learning? Oh, it's an English lesson. Awesome. Oh, this is talking about the road. I was about to say, that's really pretty. Look at this road. Ooh, that looks treacherous to drive up, but kind of fun. Driving in San Francisco has spoiled me to where I'm like, oh, a challenging road. Awesome. Anyway. A big shipping boat. A big container ship. And some wonderful, this is the faces of Colombia. Some fantastic faces in this photo, isn't there? Oh, so happy. Wonderful, wonderful smiles in there. Let's see, this is the richest man in Colombia, Luis Carlos Sarmiento. Here's a very lovely Afro-Colombian woman doing a dance. And here's what some of the traditional people in Colombia wear. She's a Colombiano woman. They have these really beautiful clothes, and then they wear these felt hats. It's really distinct, and I like it. It's really cool. Here's a map of some of the indigenous groups throughout Colombia. As you can see, there are many different ones. Very different cultures, very different styles. Carefully turn the page. These people are Kogi, These are priests. Kogi people wear all white, and they live in these cool little huts in the north of the country. Some more tribal peoples here. Let's see what it says. Oh, these are Nunuk people that live in the Amazon. And here's a population map. You can really see that everyone lives just up in this area, not so much in this area. Let's see, enjoying the beach on a hot day, probably working hard on the road. And Catholicism is the major religion in Colombia, even though the new constitution declares freedom of religion, so you don't have to be Catholic or anything. You can be whatever you want. Cathedral of Salt. Isn't that beautiful? And it's Ash Wednesday. Let's see. Oh, I love this cathedral. This is Los Lajas Cathedral. It's built on this bridge. That is magnificent. Prayer service, and this is Mount Monserrate, where there's a big statue of Jesus up at the top, so a lot of people make a pilgrimage up to the top of the mountain. Playing some drums, having a good time. Some of the museums in Colombia, and I love this artist, Fernando Botero. He makes big chonky statues. Funny. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, by far the most famous author in Colombia, probably South America. He's written some fantastic books. Another novelist, Fernando Vallejo, says novelist and filmmaker. Another novelist, this is Laura Restrepo. Some, let's see, cumbia music. And of course, Shakira, by far the most famous Colombian. And our queen, we stand forever. We love Shakira. I've always loved Shakira. Since her first album came out in English here, I bought it back when people bought CDs, and I listened to it non-stop. I love Shakira. This person's playing Tejo, which is, I don't know how to describe it. Like, basically you throw a rock at these boxes full of explosives, so you know you hit it when it explodes. That sounds fun. Let's see. Mariana Pejon, the second Colombian to win Olympic gold. Awesome. Scooting about. Of course, they have their helmets on. Very smart. Now that's a wonderful smile. Look at that. How sweet. Gorgeous. Scientist. So she's studying mosquitoes. And bicycling is a pretty major part of everyday life in Colombia, and bicycle racing as well. Example of a slum in Colombia, and here are some children working hard at school. Beautiful carnival. It says this Barranquilla Carnival. Isn't that gorgeous? Beautiful costumes. The food. So this is called ajiaco, which is a stew, and it looks like we've got corn and chicken, and it looks like a corn chowder. Potatoes, beans, and yummy stuff. There's arepas, which is like a kind of like in America what we would call a biscuit. They look really yummy though. Oop, we're almost done. Drinking some coffee, of course, and a very beautiful lady. The Festival of the Flowers. Isn't that lovely? So anyway, that's the end of Colombia for tonight. I have a couple other videos coming up this week about Colombia for you to enjoy. They're very nice. So be sure to subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss out. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope that you have a very good night. Good night.